Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, take just a second to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow, and honestly, I only want you to subscribe if you're genuinely enjoying what we're doing here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in, maybe grab something to drink, dim the lights if you want that extra atmosphere, and let's talk about someone who rewrote the rules of power in ways that still make historians uncomfortable. When you think of a pirate, your brain probably conjures up a very specific image. There's probably a beard involved, definitely some shouting, rum spilling everywhere, maybe a parrot perched on his shoulder squawking about treasure. The accent shifts between Scottish and Jamaican mid-sentence for no apparent reason, and there's at least one guy who looks like he discovered dental hygiene was optional and decided to take that as a personal challenge. Pirates, in our collective imagination, are beautiful disasters. They're chaos wearing a hat. They're freedom wrapped in violence and terrible decisions. And that image is comforting, isn't it? It's cinematic. It's exciting. It's also completely useless if you actually want to understand how piracy worked. Because here's the thing, chaos doesn't build empires. Chaos builds short careers and long lists of people who died doing something incredibly stupid. Real piracy, the kind that actually survives longer than a few drunken raids, the kind that expands and makes governments genuinely nervous, doesn't run on impulse and rum-fuel bravado. It runs on structure. It runs on planning. It runs on boring things like logistics, discipline, and somehow managing not to stab your coworkers during budget meetings. The pirates who lived the longest weren't the loudest ones. They were the ones who treated piracy less like an extended party, and more like a very illegal shipping company with excellent benefits and a somewhat concerning HR department. Most pirate crews were disasters actively looking for a place to happen. One unfair split of the loot, one captain with an ego the size of the ocean, and a brain the size of a walnut, one argument that started over nothing and escalated because everyone involved had been drinking warm rum in the tropical heat, and suddenly half the crew is attempting mutiny while the other half is literally falling into the ocean. Pirate democracy existed, but it was less civilized discourse and more. Everyone votes while actively holding weapons. Now imagine walking into that environment, that powder keg of egos and sharp objects, and calmly saying, "All right, everyone, here are the rules. No random violence. No stealing from civilians unless I say so. No freelancing. No making decisions based on your feelings. No stupidity. And if you break these rules, the punishment will be immediate, clear, consistent, and utterly without drama." This is the moment where in every pirate movie ever made, the crew laughs. They mock. They dismiss. In real life, when the most powerful pirate in history said this, they listened. They listened because pirates, despite their reputation, didn't actually want chaos. They wanted to live. They wanted to get paid. They wanted to stop dying because their captain made yet another heroic, but catastrophically stupid decision that got half the crew killed for no good reason. Order, it turns out, is extremely attractive when your alternative is drowning or starving or getting shot because nobody bothered to plan anything. History really struggles with this part of the story. People prefer their pirates as lovable disasters, as romantic rebels who thumb their noses at authority and live free. We don't like admitting that the most powerful pirate who ever lived wasn't wild, wasn't drunk, wasn't reckless, but was calm, organized, and frighteningly good at management. No parrot. No buried treasure. No inspirational speeches delivered while standing dramatically at the bow of a ship. Just systems, rules, structure, and a pirate empire that actually worked, which honestly is far more unsettling than any amount of sword fighting and rum drinking. Before she terrified governments, humbled navies, and turned piracy into something resembling a structured career path with advancement opportunities, Zheng Yi's Saul was born in 1775 near Xinhui, Guangdong. Wikipedia. She lived a life so unremarkable that history barely bothered to notice her, which in hindsight was a catastrophic oversight on history's part. She was born into a world that had already decided several things for her. That she would not rule. That she would not command. That she would certainly, absolutely not end up negotiating with an empire from a position of strength, while they tried desperately not to look as weak as they felt. Her early life didn't involve swords, or ships, or dramatic speeches delivered into the wind. It involved survival. Quiet, uncelebrated survival. The kind that teaches you to watch, to listen, and to remember exactly who holds real power in any given room. She may have worked on a floating brothel in Guangdong. Wikipedia, though the evidence for this is actually pretty thin and mostly comes from sources that seem to think this detail explained everything about her later success, which it absolutely doesn't. What it does explain, if it's true, is that she spent her formative years surrounded by powerful men who assumed she was invisible. And men, throughout history, have proven to be remarkably honest when they think nobody important is listening. She would have learned how deals were actually made, not the official version, but the real version. How egos worked. How promises were made and broken. How influence flowed sideways through social networks rather than downward through official channels. She learned that authority didn't always come from the person shouting loudest, and that the most dangerous people in any room were often the quietest ones, the ones watching and remembering everything. When pirate Captain Zheng Yi entered her life in 1801 Wikipedia, this was not a fairy tale. This wasn't love at first sight or destiny bringing two souls together. This was an opportunity. This was a partnership, a strategic alignment. One version suggests Zheng Yi proposed to her, while another version claimed she convinced him to marry her. potentially with a formal contract granting her 50% control Wikipedia. Either way, she didn't suddenly become powerful by marrying him. She gained something far more valuable. Access. Access to ships, crews, trade routes, and an entire floating underworld held together by tradition, intimidation, and genuinely terrible habits. And she watched everything. She watched how captains argued with each other over nothing. How loot got divided in ways that satisfied nobody. How resentment built slowly until it exploded suddenly. How violence solved problems temporarily and created new ones immediately. Most pirates saw this chaos as inevitable, as just part of the pirate lifestyle, like scurvy or poor hygiene or the constant smell of unwashed men living in close quarters. She saw it as inefficient. She saw it as fixable. This is the part history often skips over because frankly it's not exciting. There are no battles here. No explosions. No dramatic confrontations. Just a woman quietly absorbing information while everyone around her assumed she was background decoration, a pirate's wife, interesting only in relation to her husband. But this is where her real power was forged. Not in some dramatic moment of revelation, but in years of careful observation. Because when her moment came, and it would come sooner than anyone expected, she didn't need to improvise. She didn't need to figure things out on the fly. She already knew exactly how the entire pirate world worked, and more importantly, she knew exactly how it didn't work and what needed to change. Zheng helped create a coalition that became known as the Red Flag Fleet Wikipedia. He was already a powerful pirate commander, leading what was less a unified fleet and more a loose confederation of ships that cooperated when it was convenient and profitable, and argued constantly when it wasn't. It worked, barely, in the way that many pirate organizations worked. It survived on tradition, on intimidation, and on the unspoken agreement that nobody would ask too many uncomfortable questions as long as the loot kept coming and everyone got their share. Marrying Zheng did not magically grant her power. Pirates, shockingly, were not known for having progressive views on leadership or gender equality. What the marriage gave her was something far more valuable than immediate power. It gave her proximity. She was suddenly close to captains, to lieutenants, to the people actually making decisions. She heard arguments before they escalated into mutinies. She saw how alliances formed and collapsed. She watched men sabotage each other while insisting to everyone that everything was fine. And most importantly, she noticed patterns. She noticed that pirate loyalty was incredibly fragile, that crews followed strength rather than sentiment, that captains who ruled purely through fear lasted longer than those who ruled through charisma alone. But that fear by itself still wasn't quite enough. People needed predictability. They needed to know what the rules were, even if those rules were harsh or brutal. They needed to understand what would get them killed and what wouldn't. Zheng ran his fleet well by pirate standards, but pirate standards were forgiving. Leadership was personal. Justice was inconsistent. Punishments depended on mood, on reputation, on how loudly someone complained. Chaos was just accepted as part of the lifestyle. She didn't see chaos as inevitable. She saw it as wasteful. And while Zheng led battles and negotiated alliances with other pirate captains, she quietly built relationships. She spoke with captains. She listened to grievances. She positioned herself not as a rival to anyone's authority, but as a stabilizing presence, someone who remembered what had been agreed to, someone who didn't drink before important meetings, someone who didn't try to solve every disagreement by pulling out a weapon. Pirates noticed this, even if they didn't fully understand why it mattered yet, even if they couldn't articulate what made her different. In November 1807, Zheng died, likely in a typhoon. Wikipedia. Not heroically. Not dramatically. Just inconveniently. And the pirate world braced for collapse. This is what always happened when pirate leadership disappeared. Conflicts that had been kept barely in check were expected to explode. Fleets should have splintered immediately. Rivals should have fought for dominance in increasingly violent ways. The Confederation should have torn itself apart within weeks. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. She stepped forward calmly, already prepared, already knowing who would resist and who would fall in line. And that's when piracy stopped being improvisation and became administration. When Zheng died, the pirate world did what it always did when leadership suddenly vanished. It panicked. Knives were sharpened. People started quietly planning betrayals. Everyone began positioning themselves for what came next. Pirate confederations, historically speaking, were not known for smooth transitions of power. They were known for sudden accidents, suspicious disappearances, and arguments that ended with someone being thrown overboard mid-sentence, their last words lost to the wind and the waves. By all historical logic, by every pattern that had ever played out before, this should have been the end. A powerful leader was gone. Rival captains had old grudges they'd been waiting to settle. Fleets had overlapping territories and competing interests. Everyone wanted a bigger share of the profits, and absolutely nobody wanted to take orders from anyone else, especially not from a woman. Pirate culture was many things, but progressive wasn't remotely one of them. So expectations were clear. The red flag fleet would fracture. Captains would split off with their ships. Alliances would collapse. The South China Sea would fill with smaller, weaker pirate bands fighting each other for scraps instead of coordinating against merchants and navies. And for a brief moment, it almost happened. Captains gathered. Voices rose. Old arguments resurfaced. Everyone waited for someone to make a move, preferably a violent one, because violence was familiar. Violence was how pirates had always solved succession problems. What nobody expected was patience. Zheng Saw effectively inherited her deceased husband's informal command over the entire pirate confederation. Wikipedia. But she didn't rush forward declaring herself ruler. She didn't threaten anyone. She didn't plead. She didn't perform the traditional pirate ritual of shouting loudly and daring someone to challenge her authority. Instead, she waited. She let the tension build. She let everyone reveal exactly what they wanted, what they feared, what they were willing to fight for. Then she started talking, quietly, individually, strategically. She reminded captains of existing agreements, of promises made, of arrangements that benefited everyone. She offered stability where chaos loomed. She promised predictable rules instead of arbitrary punishment based on whoever was angriest that day. And when persuasion didn't work, when certain captains still resisted, she made it very clear that resistance would not be tolerated. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but efficiently, permanently. This was deeply unsettling to pirates. They were used to leaders who ruled through rage or through raw charisma. She ruled through something that felt almost like gravity, like inevitability. Every option that didn't involve following her ended badly. Not immediately, which would have been exciting and would have felt like a fair fight, but slowly, painfully, and without any profit at the end. And pirates, for all their reputation as wild rebels, were fundamentally practical people. They understood math. They understood that fragmentation meant death and unity meant survival, and she made Zheng Bao the official commander of the Red Flag Fleet while she maintained overall control Wikipedia, which was a brilliant move because it gave the fleet a public leader men could relate to while she operated behind the scenes where the real power lived. Within weeks, not months but weeks, the fleets aligned. Not because they suddenly respected her as a person, not because they had some revelation about women's capabilities, but because she made it absolutely clear that any other choice was suicide. The Red Flag Fleet did not collapse. It reorganized. It became more efficient. And in that moment, piracy stopped being a loose criminal lifestyle and became something far more dangerous. A centralized power structure with a single strategic mind at the helm. What made Zheng Yi truly dangerous wasn't violence. Plenty of pirates throughout history were violent. What set her apart was that she understood something most leaders never grasp. You don't actually need to swing a sword if everyone already knows you'll win. She didn't seize power by dueling rival captains on deck at sunrise. There were no dramatic showdowns. No speeches about destiny or honor. No inspirational shouting into the sea breeze while music swelled in the background. Instead, she did something far more unsettling to anyone watching. She organized. Her first move wasn't punishment. It wasn't making an example of someone. It was structure. She clarified chains of command so everyone knew who reported to whom. She confirmed territories so fleets weren't accidentally competing with each other. She standardized how loot got distributed. Every captain knew what they were owed, when they would get it, and what happened if they tried to take more than their share. Pirates, it turns out, behave much better when accounting becomes predictable. Then came the rules. These weren't vague pirate guidelines that you could ignore if you were important enough or loud enough. These were laws. Written down. Memorized. Enforced. She created a severe code where death was a constant threat for disobedience and evasion. Stealing from civilians meant execution. Disobeying direct orders meant execution. Rape meant execution. No debate. No exceptions. No dramatic appeals to pirate honor or second chances. The punishment was public and immediate. This shocked everyone, not because pirates were suddenly offended by violence, but because violence was no longer random. It was controlled, purposeful, bureaucratic, and nothing terrifies criminals more than consistency. When you can't predict the rules, you can navigate around authority through charm or luck or timing. When the rules are crystal clear and the enforcement is automatic, there's nowhere to hide. Zheng Yi also understood incentives in a way most leaders don't. Loyalty was rewarded. Competence was promoted. Captains who delivered results kept their ships and their positions. Captains who caused chaos, who created problems, quietly disappeared from leadership. She didn't remove them in fits of rage. She removed them in ways that felt inevitable, like gravity, like natural consequences. And she listened. This part gets overlooked a lot, but she listened to grievances. She adjusted strategy based on what her captains told her. She paid attention to logistics, to food supply, to crew morale, to ship maintenance. All the boring parts of running an organization that most pirate leaders ignored because they weren't exciting. Under her rule, piracy became less romantic adventure and more well-run maritime operation with excellent benefits and a terrible retirement plan. The result was immediate. Mutinies dropped dramatically. Profits increased. Ships coordinated instead of competing with each other. Pirates stopped fighting each other and focused all that violent energy on everyone else, which historically speaking is a very bad sign for everyone else. Zheng Yi didn't conquer through fear alone. She conquered through order. And once pirates realized that life under her command meant fewer stupid deaths, more money, and actual rules they could understand and follow, they stopped questioning her authority entirely. She didn't need to constantly wave a sword around. The system itself did the cutting. Once she had control, once the pirate world stopped looking like a collection of unruly ships and started looking like something far more alarming, she created what became a mighty confederation of 6 fearsome squadrons flying colored flags: black, white, green, blue, yellow, and the supreme red flags: pirates and privateers. This wasn't branding. This wasn't just pretty colors. This was administration. This was organization on a scale that most nations at the time couldn't match. The fleet was divided by these colored flags, with red being the largest and most powerful under her direct control. Each squadron was assigned specific routes, specific responsibilities, specific targets. This meant pirates stopped accidentally attacking each other, which had previously been a popular and expensive pastime. It also meant that when one fleet moved, the others knew about it in advance. They could coordinate. Strategy replaced random hoping. Planning replaced vibes and gut feelings. Under Zheng Yi's saw, piracy became synchronized. Ships didn't just wander the sea hoping to bump into merchant vessels like drunk seagulls looking for fish. They patrolled. They blockaded. They controlled choke points. By 1804, 400 junks and 70,000 men sailed under this combined fleet, pirates and privateers. Entire stretches of coastline became operational zones, which is pirate terminology for, "Don't even think about sailing here without paying us first." And it worked. It worked so well it was terrifying. Merchants rerouted trade. Ports paid protection money. Villages learned which flags meant they could negotiate, and which flags meant immediate compliance was the only option. The red flag fleet didn't even need to attack constantly anymore. Its presence alone was enough. Its reputation did half the work. That's the dream of every empire throughout history, to win without fighting, or at least without unnecessary fighting. What terrified governments the most wasn't the sheer number of ships, though that was certainly concerning. It was the discipline. Pirate fleets throughout history were supposed to collapse under pressure. They were supposed to fight among themselves over treasure and status. They were supposed to make mistakes driven by ego and impulse. This fleet didn't. Orders were followed precisely. Signals were obeyed. Retreats were organized and coordinated. Captains reported up the chain of command instead of improvising heroic disasters that got everyone killed. For imperial officials watching from shore, watching this impossible thing unfold, this was deeply, profoundly unsettling. They weren't dealing with criminals anymore. They were dealing with a rival power structure, one that didn't bother with bureaucracy or paperwork but understood logistics and strategy frighteningly well. And through all of this, Zheng Yi remained distant from the front lines. She didn't sail at the very front waving flags and yelling. She didn't perform dramatic intimidation theatrics. She ruled from behind the scenes, issuing directives, approving plans, and letting her system do most of the work. The pirates didn't need to see her constantly. They felt her presence in the rules, in the structure, in the swift consequences when anyone stepped out of line. By this point, piracy under Zheng Yi's wasn't a lifestyle choice made by rebels. It was a profession. It was a career with benefits, clear advancement paths, and an extremely unforgiving retirement plan if you tried to leave on bad terms. Pirates throughout history have never been known for having rules. That's kind of their entire brand. Rules are for governments, for monasteries, for people who enjoy paperwork and predictability. Pirates, according to popular belief and countless movies, are supposed to be fueled entirely by impulse and poor life choices. Zheng Yisao looked at that entire tradition and basically said, "No, that's stupid. We're doing this differently." One of her first and most radical decisions was to introduce a formal code of laws. Not suggestions. Not guidelines that you could interpret creatively. Actual rules with clearly defined punishments. This was revolutionary in pirate culture. Pirates were used to captains making decisions based on their mood that morning, their ego, how recently someone had insulted them, or how much rum they consumed. Under her system, behavior was no longer a gamble. You knew exactly where the line was. The rules were brutally simple. Disobey orders? Execution. Steal from civilians without authorization? Execution. Rape? Immediate execution. Hiding stolen goods from the communal pool? You guessed it. This wasn't moral reform. This wasn't her suddenly developing a conscience about pirate behavior. This was quality control. This was understanding that unchecked cruelty is genuinely bad for business. Think about it. Random violence scares merchants so badly they avoid your waters entirely, which means no targets, which means no loot. Assaulting civilians invites retaliation from governments, who might have otherwise looked the other way. Internal theft breeds resentment, which breeds mutiny, which breeds knives and backs during the night. Her laws weren't about kindness or ethics. They were about efficiency. They were about building something that could sustain itself long-term instead of burning bright and collapsing. And pirates, surprisingly, really appreciated this. Knowing exactly where the line was meant you could operate right up to it without fear of arbitrary punishment from an angry captain. The rules applied to everyone. This alone was shocking. Under previous pirate leaders, captains could get away with almost anything as long as they were feared or respected enough. Under Zheng Yisao, rank didn't grant immunity from the rules. It granted responsibility, which is actually a terrifying upgrade when you think about it. Punishments were public, and that was deliberate, not theatrical, not designed to be entertaining, instructional. Everyone knew exactly what happened when rules were broken. There was no confusion, no debate, no appeals to emotion or to personal relationships. The system spoke clearly and only once. You broke the rule, here's the consequence, no negotiation. The result was immediate discipline across the fleet. Pirates stopped freelancing, stopped going off on unauthorized raids. They stopped terrorizing villages unnecessarily, which was probably quite a relief for the villages. They followed orders. Loot flowed upward through proper channels, was redistributed fairly according to the agreed formula, and morale actually improved. It improved in that deeply unsettling way that happens when criminals realize they're actually safer and better off inside a system than outside it. To outside observers, to governments and foreign powers watching this unfold, this was horrifying. They expected pirates to implode under pressure, to fall apart when things got difficult. Instead, the pirates became more organized the harder they were pushed. Zheng Yi had done something no pirate leader in history had ever managed. She made lawlessness predictable. She made chaos systematic. And predictability in the hands of someone this competent, someone this strategic, was infinitely more dangerous than chaos ever could have been. The obvious explanation for why pirates followed Zheng Yi is fear. And yes, fear definitely played a role. The punishments were real. They were immediate. They were memorable in the worst possible way. But fear alone does not hold together tens of thousands of armed criminals for long. Fear creates obedience in the short term and resentment that builds into mutiny in the long term. What actually kept her pirates loyal, what actually made the system work, was something far more effective than fear. Life genuinely got better under her rule. Under previous pirate leaders, survival was basically optional. A nice bonus if it happened, but not guaranteed. Captains made impulsive decisions based on pride or anger. Ships fought battles they didn't need to fight because someone wanted to prove a point. Crews died because their captain had something to prove. Loot was divided unfairly, usually favoring whoever shouted loudest or happened to be holding a weapon during the distribution meeting. Being a pirate meant freedom, sure. Freedom to be killed by your own side on a bad day. Freedom to starve because somebody stole the food. Freedom to die pointlessly. Zheng Yi removed that uncertainty. Under her system, pirates knew what they would earn. They knew exactly what behavior would get them punished. They knew which risks were worth taking and which were pointless suicide. This might sound dull, this might sound boring, but dull is absolutely excellent when your workplace involves cannon fire and sword fights and the constant possibility of drowning. She also understood incentives better than almost any leader in history. Competent captains were rewarded with better routes, with larger shares, with more authority. Crews that followed orders were protected from internal theft and random violence from their own side. Discipline didn't just prevent chaos. It made piracy genuinely profitable again. Ships weren't wasting resources fighting each other. They were focusing on actual targets. Even more important, she dramatically reduced stupid deaths. This cannot be overstated. Pirates in real life did not romanticize dying in battle. That myth was invented later by people who never had to swab a deck or worry about scurvy. Real pirates wanted to live, to eat well, to eventually retire somewhere warm with all their limbs still attached and maybe some money saved up. Under Zheng Yi, survival rates improved dramatically. There were fewer unnecessary fights. More coordinated attacks that actually worked. Clean retreats when situations turned unfavorable instead of fighting to the pointless death for honor. And then there was fairness, which seemed like a strange thing to associate with pirates, but it mattered. Her laws applied to everyone. Captains could not abuse crew members without consequences anymore. Favoritism decreased significantly. Justice became consistent. Harsh, absolutely, but predictable. Pirates might hate rules in theory, but they hate arbitrary authority even more. They hate not knowing where they stand. So obedience wasn't forced every single day through threats. It became habitual. It became the path of least resistance. By the time her empire reached its height, pirates weren't following her because they were personally terrified of her. Many of them had never even met her. They followed the system she built because stepping outside that system meant chaos, meant loss, meant almost certain death. In the end, Zheng Yi didn't rule like a tyrant shouting from the deck. She ruled like gravity, always present, impossible to argue with, absolutely unforgiving if you decided to ignore it. For a long time, governments had treated piracy the way most people treat bad weather. Unpleasant, annoying, occasionally destructive, but largely unavoidable. You lost a few ships. Merchants complained. Officials wrote concerned reports. Life went on. Pirates were criminals, not competitors. They were a nuisance to be managed, not a threat to be taken seriously. Zheng Yi changed that calculation entirely. Suddenly trade routes stopped functioning normally. Merchant ships vanished or refused to sail altogether. Coastal towns learned very quickly that paying pirates was cheaper than trusting the Navy to protect them history heroines. Entire regions of the South China Sea operated under an unspoken understanding. If the Red Flag Fleet allowed you to trade, you could trade. If it didn't, you didn't. Simple as that. This was not a nuisance anymore. This was economic disruption on a scale that affected tax revenue and imperial authority. Officials began to realize something deeply uncomfortable. They were no longer dealing with scattered criminals who could be ignored or dealt with eventually. They were dealing with a parallel power structure that collected revenue, enforced its own laws, and controlled territory. And unlike a traditional government, this power structure moved. It was fluid. It was adaptive. Reports kept pouring in from the coast describing pirate fleets that coordinated attacks across hundreds of miles, withdrew strategically when outnumbered, and returned exactly when expected. This was not how pirates were supposed to behave. Pirates throughout history were supposed to be impulsive, sloppy, predictable in their unpredictability. These pirates under Zheng Yi were efficient. They were organized. They planned. Imperial officials tried the usual approaches. They issued stern orders. They increased patrols, though this mostly resulted in those patrols being defeated or avoiding pirates entirely. They tried pretending the problem wasn't that serious, which is always a solid strategy for problems that are actively getting worse. That phase of denial did not last long. Merchant losses mounted. Tax revenue declined. Local authorities, the ones actually living on the coast, began quietly negotiating with the pirates on their own because being alive and employed tomorrow mattered more than loyalty to distant superiors who didn't understand the situation. And then there was the humiliation factor, which in Imperial China was not a small thing. In July 1808 and July 1809, she twice obliterated Chinese naval fleets guarding the river delta between Portuguese Macau and Canton World History Encyclopedia. Navies were built to fight other navies, not criminals with better local knowledge, faster ships, and zero interest in playing by traditional rules of naval warfare. Every failed engagement made the situation worse. Each loss didn't just weaken the state materially. It made the pirates look legitimate by comparison. It made people question whether the government could actually protect anyone. The most alarming realization, the one that kept officials awake at night, was this. The pirates weren't trying to overthrow the government. They weren't making grand revolutionary proclamations. They weren't claiming divine authority or trying to establish their own dynasty. They were simply operating so effectively that the state's authority became optional in large regions. That's the nightmare scenario for any government. When people stop asking, "Can the government protect us?" and start asking, "Will the pirates leave us alone if we cooperate?" legitimacy collapses quietly. No speeches. No declarations. Just a shift in who people actually listen to. By this point, the question for imperial officials was no longer, "How do we stop her?" It was, "How do we survive this without looking completely powerless?" And that's when the situation shifted from attempted suppression to negotiation, because sometimes accepting reality is the only option left. When persuasion failed, when economic pressure didn't work, when pretending the problem would solve itself proved to be wishful thinking, governments did what governments always do when they're embarrassed and out of options. They reached for military force. In 1808, the Chinese Qing government, overwhelmed by pirates in the South China Sea, decided to take out the Red Flag Fleet Military.com. The Qing Navy prepared to confront them directly, fully expecting that once real warships arrived with trained crews and proper military discipline, the pirate problem would politely collapse. It did not collapse. On paper, the Navy had every advantage you could imagine. Larger ships, heavier guns, formal military training, officers with ranks and medals and impressive hats. What they absolutely did not have was flexibility or any meaningful experience fighting an enemy that refused to behave like a proper navy. Zheng Yisaw's fleets did not line up for glorious set-piece battles. They didn't announce themselves with honor and give the navy time to prepare. They didn't stay in one place. They struck quickly, hit hard, and retreated before reinforcements could arrive. Then they vanished into familiar coastal waters where imperial ships struggled to maneuver without running aground. When pursued, pirate vessels scattered in multiple directions like birds, only to regroup hours later somewhere else entirely, completely intact. Naval commanders were absolutely furious. How do you defeat an enemy that refuses to stand still? An enemy that insists on choosing when to fight, where to fight, and whether to fight at all, rather than retreat when outnumbered, Zheng Yi sailed right for government forces, and when the smoke cleared, the red flag fleet left behind burning hulks of roughly half the Qing Navy military.com. The situation got worse. Pirate intelligence was excellent. Local fishermen, merchants, and coastal communities often warned the pirates of naval movements long before the ships arrived. World History Encyclopedia. Sometimes this was fear motivating them. Sometimes it was profit. Sometimes it was just simple pragmatism. The pirates were close, present, immediate. The Navy was distant and unreliable. People made rational choices about who to cooperate with. Engagement after engagement ended the same frustrating way for the imperial forces. The Navy would approach with grand intentions. The pirates would withdraw strategically. Smaller imperial vessels would get isolated and captured. Larger ships would struggle to bring their superior firepower to bear against faster, more maneuverable targets that knew these waters intimately. Every failure made the next operation harder because morale among the naval crews eroded quickly when sailors realized they were fighting an opponent who was genuinely smarter than their commanders. The psychological damage was worse than the material losses, and the material losses were significant. A navy that cannot defeat pirates begins to look unnecessary. Officials noticed this. Merchants definitely noticed. Pirates absolutely noticed, and used it to their advantage. Each failed campaign reinforced the idea that the Red Flag Fleet was untouchable. Not invincible necessarily, but uncatchable. And there's a meaningful difference. You can't destroy what you can't catch. Zheng Yi didn't need to destroy the Imperial Navy entirely. She only needed to make it ineffective, to make it look weak and incompetent. And she succeeded brilliantly. By the time officials were finally willing to admit the truth to themselves, the situation had reversed completely. The state was no longer suppressing piracy. It was reacting to it. It was responding to pirate movements instead of controlling the situation. And once a government is reacting instead of controlling, once it's defensive instead of offensive, the battle is already functionally lost, even if nobody's ready to say it out loud yet. By this point in her story, something deeply uncomfortable had happened. Something that made imperial officials profoundly uneasy. Zheng Yi was no longer being hunted. She was being accounted for. She was being worked around. Officials stopped asking how to destroy her fleets and started asking how to avoid provoking them unnecessarily. Merchant captains adjusted their routes based not on weather or seasonal winds, but on pirate schedules. Coastal towns learned which colored flags meant there was room for negotiation, and which flags meant immediate compliance was the only safe option. This is usually the moment in history when someone in power quietly admits, "We may have lost control of this situation," and then immediately pretends that was always the plan, that they meant for it to happen this way. Zheng Yi commanded the waters of the China Sea unimpeded pirates and privateers. She controlled shipping lanes. She controlled food supplies moving along the coast. She controlled information because her network of ships and informants saw everything happening on the water. And she did all of this without ever declaring herself empress, or claiming a throne, or issuing proclamations about her divine right to rule. There were no crowns, no elaborate ceremonies, no manifestos, just results, just undeniable, unavoidable effectiveness. This made her extremely difficult to fight using traditional methods. Navies can attack other armies. Governments can crush rebellions that openly challenge their authority. But how do you attack a system that has already woven itself seamlessly into everyday life? How do you remove something that's become necessary? Remove the pirates and trade collapses because nobody else is providing protection on the water. Remove the pirates and coastal villages lose the protection they've been paying for. Remove the pirates and suddenly everyone remembers how ineffective the official navy was before all this started, how unreliable, how slow to respond. At her peak, Zheng Yi didn't even need to issue constant orders anymore. The structure she built ran itself. Captains enforced the rules automatically. Crews followed established procedures. Punishments happened without her personal involvement. Even loyalty had become self-sustaining because defecting meant losing protection, losing income, and losing any realistic chance of survival. This is the moment she became truly dangerous in a way that transcends simple military power. Not when she had the most ships, not when she won the most battles, but when she no longer needed to personally prove anything to anyone. When the system she created could function without her constant direct involvement. Governments realized with growing horror that even if they somehow managed to destroy part of her fleet in battle, the rest would continue operating smoothly. It was like trying to punch fog and being surprised when your hand stays wet afterward. She wasn't a single point of failure that could be eliminated to collapse everything. She had built redundancy into the system. And perhaps most unsettling of all to imperial officials, she didn't seem interested in pushing further. She didn't demand territory in the traditional sense. She didn't attempt to overthrow the Qing dynasty. She didn't march on Beijing making grand demands. She simply existed, powerful enough to ruin maritime trade, stable enough to keep it flowing under her terms, and smart enough not to overreach in ways that would force the empire into total war. This left officials with an impossible choice. They could continue losing resources, ships, and credibility in a war they fundamentally could not win, or they could accept that the most powerful force in their waters wasn't wearing an imperial uniform and probably never would. And once that realization fully settled in, once pride gave way to pragmatism, the next step became inevitable. Negotiation. After years of defeating navies, humiliating officials, and running what was probably the most efficient pirate organization in human history, Zheng Yi did something that no pirate legend, no adventure story, no romantic tale of rebellion and freedom prepares you for. She stopped. Not because she was losing. Not because she was betrayed by someone close to her. Not because the empire suddenly found its courage or developed a brilliant new strategy. She retired. She just stopped being a pirate. This is the moment where every pirate story throughout history usually ends in blood, betrayal, or a noose. History is remarkably consistent about this. Pirates are not supposed to age gracefully. They're supposed to die loudly, dramatically, providing clear moral lessons about the consequences of defying authority. Zheng Yi looked at this entire tradition and decided to ignore it completely. She chose the most rebellious act imaginable in the context of pirate culture. She quit while she was winning. In early 1810, Zheng Yi approached Guangdong Governor-General Bai Ling to discuss amnesty not even passed. By this point, the Qing government understood something that was deeply uncomfortable to admit. They could continue fighting her indefinitely, continuing to bleed ships, money, and credibility, watching their authority erode with each passing month, or they could accept reality and negotiate with a woman who had already beaten them in every way that actually mattered. So they negotiated. The talks began carefully, quietly, with the particular tone people use when negotiating with someone who absolutely does not need to agree with them, someone who holds all the practical power and is just being generous by even showing up. Zheng Yi listened. She didn't beg. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to do either. She simply made it clear that she had options, and she had time, and they were the ones in a hurry. Her terms were audacious but straightforward. Amnesty for herself and her followers, the right to keep her wealth, protection for her people from future prosecution, and recognition that this entire arrangement was essentially the government admitting defeat without actually using that word not even passed. And here's the part that still confuses and frustrates historians trying to fit her story into familiar patterns. The government agreed. They didn't like it. They didn't celebrate it. But they signed the agreement because at that stage, the choice wasn't between victory and surrender. It was between controlled peace that let them save some face and endless embarrassment that would continue undermining their authority. For the pirates, who had spent their entire lives expecting betrayal, expecting that any deal with government would end with them in chains or worse, this was surreal. Their leader wasn't being executed. She wasn't being imprisoned. She wasn't being publicly humiliated and erased from history. She was being acknowledged. She was being treated as a legitimate negotiating partner. Zheng Yi walked away from piracy not in chains, but with legitimacy, wealth, and freedom not even passed. No dramatic last stand on the deck of a burning ship. No gallows. No betrayal at sea. Just a woman who looked at the entire situation with clear eyes, calculated the odds, understood exactly what she'd built and what it was worth, and decided that the smartest possible move was to stop playing the game. Which, when you think about it, might be the most pirate thing she ever did. Taking what she wanted and leaving on her terms. The amnesty agreement was not an act of mercy from a benevolent government. Let's be very clear about that. It was a confession. When the Qing government accepted Zheng Yisaw's terms in 1810, they weren't being generous Wikipedia. They were being realistic in a way that must have hurt. Empires do not negotiate with criminals as equals unless those criminals have already won. And by this point, she had won so thoroughly, so completely, that the state was simply choosing the least humiliating exit available from an impossible situation. What makes this moment extraordinary in history isn't that she accepted amnesty. Pirates throughout history have tried to negotiate pardons. What's extraordinary is how much she kept. She did not surrender her wealth. She did not turn over her ships in disgrace. She did not disappear quietly into exile wearing rags Wikipedia. Her followers were pardoned. Many of her pirates were absorbed into the official imperial navy, not even passed, which is an absolutely astonishing sentence when you say it out loud. Pirates, who had spent years defeating, humiliating, and sinking imperial forces were suddenly wearing imperial uniforms. This is what happens when you can't beat someone. Eventually you just hire them. And Zheng Yi saw herself? She walked away free, wealthy, and respected enough that no one dared touch her afterward. This was not forgiveness from the government. This was containment. The empire wasn't rewarding her for good behavior. They were ensuring she never had a reason to return to piracy, never had a reason to rebuild her network and start this entire nightmare over again. What's truly remarkable is how clean the transition was, how smoothly it happened. No betrayal at the last moment. No sudden arrests once she disbanded her fleet. No mysterious disappearances. History is absolutely full of governments and rulers who promised mercy and then delivered chains or poison or execution once their enemy was vulnerable. This was not one of those stories. The Qing government actually honored the agreement, and they honored it because breaking their word would have been genuinely dangerous. Not just militarily dangerous, though that was certainly a concern, but symbolically dangerous. Zheng Yisaw had already proven beyond any doubt that authority without legitimacy collapses. That you can have all the official power in the world, but if people don't believe in it, if they don't cooperate, that power becomes meaningless. The state was not eager to remind everyone of that lesson again by betraying her and potentially inspiring new resistance. And then she did something even more impressive than forcing the empire to negotiate. She vanished from the pirate world completely. No resistance from former followers. No splinter factions trying to keep the empire alive. No dramatic comeback attempt 5 years later. She dismantled her own system properly and deliberately Wikipedia. Orders were passed down through proper channels. Ships were reassigned. Crews were dispersed. Piracy didn't explode into chaos. It just faded. That alone demonstrates how complete her control had been, how thoroughly she'd built loyalty and structure. This wasn't a pirate empire collapsing into civil war. This was a pirate empire closing its operations in an orderly fashion. The state eventually regained control of the South China Sea, but not because they conquered her. They regained it because she allowed them to, on her terms, at her timing, when it benefited her most. Most pirates throughout history die fighting empires and lose. Zheng Yi forced an empire to negotiate with reality itself. And that might be the most powerful act in this entire story. After dismantling the most powerful pirate empire in human history, after forcing a major empire to negotiate its own embarrassment and sign papers admitting she won, Zheng Yi did something that must have seemed absolutely scandalous by pirate standards. She settled down. She retired. Like a normal person. No dramatic exile to a hidden island. No fortress where she lived in paranoid isolation surrounded by guards. No endless looking over her shoulder waiting for assassins. She opened a gambling house Wikipedia, which honestly makes perfect sense when you think about it. After years of managing thousands of pirates, dealing with egos and violence and complex logistics, running a business where people voluntarily give you money and argue about rules probably felt genuinely relaxing. Compared to commanding fleets and negotiating with empires, dealing with gamblers must have seemed refreshingly simple and predictable. She lived openly, comfortably, peacefully, and perhaps most unsettling of all to anyone expecting a more dramatic ending, she was left completely alone. No one hunted her. No imperial official showed up years later claiming there was a small technical issue with the amnesty paperwork, and could she please come with them. The agreement held because everyone involved understood something very clearly. Disturbing her peace would be an unnecessary gamble with extremely poor odds. History really struggles with this part of her life. Chroniclers tend to lose interest once the violence stops, once there are no more battles to describe, no betrayals to dramatize. No ships sinking dramatically. Just a woman who outlived her enemies, enjoyed her wealth, and watched the world move on around her. And that's exactly why this ending matters so much. Most pirate legends throughout history are warnings. They exist to tell you what happens when you defy the state, when you challenge authority, when you step outside the rules. You get caught. You get executed publicly. Order is restored. Lessons are learned. Everyone goes home feeling like justice prevailed. Zheng Yi completely ruins that entire narrative. She defied the state comprehensively, won decisively, negotiated from a position of strength, retired wealthy, and lived peacefully. No moral punishment. No tragic downfall. No karmic justice. Just competence rewarded with survival and comfort. That makes people genuinely uncomfortable. It suggests that power doesn't always belong to those with official titles or proper uniforms. That authority can be built through effectiveness rather than inherited through bloodlines. That systems and organization matter more than bravado and dramatic speeches. And that sometimes the smartest possible move isn't one last glorious fight. It's knowing exactly when to stop. In her later years, she wasn't feared as a pirate queen. She was respected as a businesswoman. Wikipedia. A former terror of the sea who had transitioned seamlessly into civilian life, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had already beaten the system once and saw no need to do it again. No one questioned her past. No one tested her patience or tried to cheat her, because absolutely everyone remembered what happened the last time she decided to organize something. She commanded 70,000 pirates. Running a gambling house was practically a vacation. History has produced many pirates over the centuries. Loud pirates who yelled constantly. Violent pirates who solved every problem with a sword. Charismatic pirates who inspired devotion. Pirates who died screaming. Pirates who were betrayed by their own crews. Pirates who became cautionary tales told by governments to scare people into obedience, to make children behave, to reinforce that crime doesn't pay and rebellion ends badly. And then there was Zheng Saw, standing apart from all of them. The reason no pirate before her or after her ever matched what she accomplished isn't because she was more brutal, though she could be brutal when necessary. Many pirates were far worse. It's not because she was luckier, though luck certainly helped. Plenty of pirates had lucky streaks that fell apart eventually. It's because she understood something fundamental that almost everyone else in history missed completely. Piracy, real piracy that lasts and grows and actually threatens established powers, is not about rebellion. It's not about freedom in the romantic sense. It's about systems. It's about organization. Most pirates throughout history chased freedom without understanding that freedom without structure is just chaos wearing a different hat. Zheng Saw chased stability. Most pirates lived moment to moment, drinking and fighting and hoping tomorrow would work out. She planned years ahead. Most pirates ruled through fear alone, which works until someone scarier shows up. She ruled through structure, through predictability, through systems that functioned whether she was physically present or not. And fear just happened to come with it as a natural consequence. She didn't romanticize piracy the way we do now. She didn't perform it for an audience. She professionalized it. She stripped away the nonsense, the ego, the pointless violence that served no purpose, and replaced all of it with rules that actually worked. Rules that made practical sense. And because those rules worked, because they made life better for the people following them, people followed them. Not because they were inspired by grand speeches. Not because they loved her personally. But because life under her command was simply, measurably better than any alternative available. That's what makes her legacy so uncomfortable for historians and storytellers trying to fit her into familiar patterns. She wasn't a tragic hero crushed by authority after a brave struggle. She wasn't a villain slain by justice at the end of the story. She wasn't even a revolutionary trying to change the world or overthrow the system for ideological reasons. she was a manager. A terrifyingly competent one who understood human nature and built systems around that understanding. And that's why history struggles to place her neatly into categories we prefer, into boxes we understand. She doesn't fit the moral frameworks we like to impose on historical figures. She proves that power doesn't always come from titles, from crowns, from legitimacy handed down through proper channels. Sometimes it comes from understanding how people actually behave, understanding what they actually need, and building systems around that reality instead of pretending humans are better or nobler than they demonstrably are. Other pirates throughout history burned bright like meteors and disappeared just as quickly. Zheng saw scaled up methodically, optimized her operations continuously, and exited the game entirely on her own terms when she decided it was time. She forced an empire to negotiate not through revolutionary ideology but through simple exhaustion, through making the cost of fighting her higher than the cost of accepting her terms. She didn't overthrow the system dramatically. She made it accommodate her. She made it bend around her until negotiation was the only rational option left. And then, when she'd taken what she wanted, when she'd proven what she wanted to prove, she walked away. No execution waiting at the end. No tragic downfall. No moral punishment inserted by history to make the story feel right. Just a woman who looked at the world exactly as it was, understood it better than everyone else involved in the situation, and used that understanding to win completely. Which may be the most unsettling pirate story of all. Not because it's violent, but because it worked, because she won, because she survived, because competence and organization defeated everything thrown against her. And if you enjoyed learning about someone who rewrote the rules of power in ways that still make people uncomfortable centuries later, hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what historical figure you'd like to hear about next. There are so many stories out there that don't fit the neat narratives we're taught. Stories that challenge everything we think we know about how power works. Until next time, thanks for watching.